Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar number 4 on materials, webinar for ArcViz in Unreal. So welcome. I'm very, very excited. We've got Wes from Allegorithmic today with us, and he has got so much knowledge to share with us. It's fantastic. Allegorithmic is a company that lives and breathes materials all day, every day. And they have created a suite of products to really help author textures and materials. So we're going to talk a lot about that, and just to recap a little bit on where we've been talking about the workflow in webinar number 2, and we talked about materials already. So this webinar is inscribed in this logic of talking about the workflow, the lighting, and now we are at materials. So we've seen in the previous webinars where this is inscribed, where we've got this node-based interface, and we have a set of very powerful nodes, which are little bits of programs that can do all sorts of things within this material editor, and we have different types of materials, blended and masks and so on. So the new thing that has hit me when I'm trying to learn this is this new idea of these new nodes, which are metallic, specular, roughness, and so on. Because like many of you, I'm sure, I've come from 3D Studio Max background, and we have things like ambient color and diffuse, specular. We use a lot the glossiness in materials, and then we have reflections. So this workflow, we're used to cheating a lot. For example, when we put a black and white bump map of a brick texture with the light coming from above, the bump is hard coded into the actual texture. Or we will put some bit of dirt in our diffuse color to add some variation, or for example the color of a metal would be in the reflection slot here. So these are all things which we're used to, and it's this new workflow, which is called physically based workflow, works differently. So what I'm not going to talk about these particular slots here, the base color metallic. We're going to do that with in just a minute. But what I want to emphasize here is that we need to go from this specular gloss to the metallic roughness, and we need to begin to view material and understand materials differently, the way we represent them, based on this physically correct setup under the hood inside. So a lot of the things, for example, Fresnel, we won't need to adjust. So moving on, after that we'll talk about this scene that I created using the new plugin from Substance inside of Unreal. So that's very, very exciting. It's just been released, so you can now download it free on the marketplace, and that gives you access to this fantastic new tool. So you've got this little lovely button here, and you can access all these materials from inside. So I'll just show you how I've done that, and it looks, and how I did it using the scene that I did for the little clip for the webinar. After that, Wes will take us through a very, very simple graph that he did in Substance to create this floor concrete material, and really emphasizing how it's super simple, really easy. And I'm then going to show you in how I used it in this map to create this floor in the scene that we now know well. And in this scene, it's the exact same material, and all I did is change the lightness. So just to show how versatile this is. So enough of me. Well, I'll stay here and ask Wes millions of questions like I'm sure you have. And so, Wes, let's get going and talk about PBR.
Okay, so in this first section, we're going to take a look at just some, theory behind PBR as well as some practical use of how to author the maps. And so one of the things that I like to mention here about PBR is just a, kind of just a brief overview of what this is. And so I like to define it as a method of shading and rendering that provides a more accurate representation of how light interacts with surfaces. And from this, I kind of extrapolate out three benefits. So number one, I like to say that it's easier to create materials as it removes guesswork from authoring surface attributes. And by that I mean that we're using actual, scientifically measured values. So we don't have to say, oh, this metal is this value. I wonder what that is. I have to try to figure it out from a photo. We just know that we're going to use this measured value and it's going to work. The next thing that I like to talk about is because we're using these measured values, that means that the materials are going to work and behave correctly in all lighting conditions. And a byproduct of that also is that it provides a workflow for creating consistent artwork. So we know that if we author our maps following these specific guidelines, they're always going to look correct in all lighting situations. And again, we don't have to worry so much about the guesswork of how these materials are authored. So Fabrice is this is actually a pretty large difference between the way materials are generally authored, or I'll say more traditionally authored.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally we were talking about old school here, I guess, in terms of the usuals, either V-Ray or 3ds Max in terms of ArcViz, where we would normally create our materials with the diffuse specular map, the all-important reflective and glossy maps, and bump using black and white. These are, I guess this is what you mean by the guesswork when we try to fake some height with a black and white bump, for example.
Yeah, and also like when you come up with for me, when I think about when I used to do 3D work, and I say again from the traditional shading standpoint, it was I never knew like, well, how specular is this, or how reflective would this be? I had a hard time trying to figure out things like IOR and Fresnel and all these things, but with PBR, all of this stuff is handled for us within the shader, so we don't have to worry about it. And that's kind of what I mean by the guesswork. Like, we don't have to worry about. We know that there's scientifically measured values that the shader is supplying for us, and then we are just feeding that our maps. And if the maps are authored correctly, then all the materials are going to look right, and we don't have to worry about a lot of things, which is I find to be very refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly when you talk about Fresnel, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the specular side of things in a minute, but certainly when we're trying to make things look right and we're sort of sliding this Fresnel value and we have no idea what the Fresnel of any material is, just looking at the image, what you're saying here is that we won't need to tweak this Fresnel because that's all been done for us scientifically under the hood, really.
Yes, correct. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And so with that, and again, like I was talking about, if we author the maps correctly, then, everything's going to work out very well for us in terms of, looking correct in all lighting conditions. So that's kind of the next part of this I want to talk about.
Yeah. So just to sum up here, the benefits, what we would tend to kind of arrive here in Unreal thinking, oh, it's new, it's more complicated, there's all these things I don't know about. What we're really saying and what needs to come through today is that everything becomes a lot easier. And what's really important to understand is how to set things up, because everything becomes a lot easier if it's set up correctly.
Yeah,
if it's not set up correctly, we're going to be scratching our head and wonder why things are not working.
Yeah, precisely. That's a great point. And as you said, setting things up correctly, it takes a little bit of a different mind shift. Basically, going to think about the way we author the content a bit differently. But once we understand that, then it's much easier to work with. And so here on this next slide is where I want to start to talk about some of what these maps are, what they actually represent, and some guidelines for how to author them. So the first one I like to start with is this base color map. And so this base color actually contains two pieces of information, I like to say. So for example, what I have is it contains diffuse reflected color. That's going to be sometimes referred to as albedo. It's just another word that you may hear often when talking about PBR. And then also it contains the metal color tint. It's reflected light. So both of these pieces of information, we're talking about color information, and we're talking about color that we see. So one example I like to say for if we're talking about diffuse reflected color, which is albedo, I'm talking about like if we take a look at an apple and we're in the kind of the red skin of an apple, so that red wavelength is reflected back to us, and that's the color that we see. So that's what I mean by that diffuse reflected color. So
just to pause you there, Wes, to make the distinction between metallic and non-metallic materials. This is the kind of the base of the PBR system, if I understand rightly, is that we've got two types of materials: one which are metallic, and one which are non-metallic, which we'll see in the next slide are dielectric. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
So we are always going to be thinking about two types of materials. One, is it metallic or is it not metallic, basically? Or if it's non-metal, you could say it's dielectric. Metals are going to be conductive. So one thing to do, I'll just take a quick step back when we talk about PBR. There's actually two methods or workflows for PBR. So you have what's sometimes referred to as base color metallic roughness, or the metallic roughness workflow. And then you also have the specular glossiness workflow. So those are two different workflows for creating PBR content. Now, specific to Unreal Engine only supports the metallic roughness input. So as you'll see later when we look at the UV4, when we talk more about the UV4 material channel inputs, we have a specular channel. We're going to talk about that a bit more. It's not the specular that you would think. And as we'll see, it's very specific to the metallic workflow. So by that, we want to make sure that we're focusing on, okay, this is using a metallic roughness workflow, which means it has a metallic map. And this metallic map is basically just a mask, a grayscale mask, where black equals non-metal and white values equal metal. And that mask is used in conjunction with this base color. So if what happens is if the shader looks at the map and it says, oh, on this metallic map, there's some white areas. So wherever this white area is, this is going to represent a metal. So I'm going to go to the base color map, and wherever those white areas from the metallic map are kind of overlap in the base color, that's going to become the metal color tint value.
So are we saying that there's only one setting for, there's only two settings for the metallic side of things, either it's metal or non-metal? Would we have any situations where it would be a little bit metal, i.e. if it's a value between 0 and 1, would have a value of 0.5, for example?
Yes, that could very well happen, and that depends more on the material blending. So a good example of that is, let's say that you had a metal value that then was corroded. So then you started to see some rust on it. So with that, you're going to have maybe some transitional values in your metallic map where it's black and white. So we've got metal and non-metal, but then some transitional values where you've got a mix of that corroded kind of rust, on top of or interacting with that metallic.
It would just indicate that transition between the metal and non-metal. What I'm saying is that, when we're used with this sort of the glossiness, the sort of, how do you call it? Specular glossy workflow, we're used to cheating a lot to achieve the result that we want. Whereas here, would you say that cheating is maybe not so advised, because we'll get into confusion when we start using like say 0.01 of metallic into a ceramic
Yeah,
looking surface.
yeah. I mean, you want to stay away from doing kind of cheating stuff because then you start to break the physics behind everything.
Yeah, yeah, okay,
And if
right.
we do that, then we start to run the risk of, okay, our materials are now kind of breaking these specific laws.
The
So
rules. Mm.
yeah, and now we can't guarantee they're going to be consistent. However, with that said, of course, there's always room for artistic interpretation on some things. So
Yeah,
sometimes you are
once you
gonna.
control it.
Yeah, it's that whole thing that that saying, once you know the rules and once you know them, then you can break them, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But yeah, just going back to one thing you said there, I just want to really make sure, like you had said with specular glossiness, we're used to doing some cheats. So I also like to say the PBR version of spec gloss is completely different than the original or more traditional spec gloss that we had before.
Right.
So even though they share the same names, it's completely different. So the data, and we won't really get into spec gloss because it's not related to UE4, but the spec gloss and the metallic roughness workflows, the data is the same. The data is exactly the
Right.
same. The maps are just authored a little bit differently. Like some data is put in one map versus it's put in a different map for the other workflow, but the data is all the same.
Right.
So yeah, what I like to say then is, kind of going back to this base color and that it represents, like I said, our albedo basically and our metal color tint values. And that is going to be, I'll say which is determined by the metallic map. So here in this slide, what I want to show is just one kind of aspect about this here. So for example, here I have this dielectric or diffuse reflected color. So just a couple of guidelines about authoring this map. So one of the things is we want to have no lighting information present. So like you had mentioned, Fabrice, we all did this as 3D artists. We were used to cheating. Sometimes we would, multiply maybe some lighting information into our diffuse map back in the old traditional workflow. So we don't want to do things like that anymore. Another thing, when we talk about our colors, the bright and dark tonality values of that, we want to start to think about value. So like a dark material is never really as dark as we might think it is in our minds. So for example, if you think about something like a lump of coal or a piece of coal, we think, oh, that's super super dark. That's one of the darkest materials. So you might be tempted to author that as in sRGB as 000 black. And that's actually would be incorrect because we're never going to have just a black value in our base color or albedo. So I like to give, so I like to give a bit of a guideline here that your dark values, they should never go lower than 30 sRGB, basically.
So when you say 30 sRGB there, does it mean 30 on a 0 to 255 scale?
Yes, that's correct. If you're looking at this, not entering floating point values, but just working with sRGB, yeah, we're talking 0 to 255. So when you have...
because obviously in Unreal, all our colors are 0 to 1, so we'll have to maybe take that into account. So that will make a little transition between 0 to 255, what 30 means. Maybe I can do the calculation here, but I was trying actually to plug these values in, thinking, what is 30 out of 0 to 1?
Oh, yeah.
It means it's going to be pretty low. It's going to be pretty near the dark. But what we're trying to avoid here is absolute black, because what the effect of that will be is to actually punch a hole in the image of something that is going to be unrealistically black.
Yeah, it's going to just give a tonal value for that material to be just unrealistic. It's not going to support, it's not going to be physically accurate. And so that's just kind of the idea that we want to have in authoring these maps. And these values I have like this, these are values like if you're using something like, say, Photoshop to author your maps, or you're in, say, Substance Designer and you're working to create your maps. We're working in 0 to 255 ranges. So that's kind of what these values are for. They're more for like in the software creation phase.
Yeah, in Photoshop and 3ds Max we'll have those sliders.
Yeah. So that kind of takes care of the dark kind of ranges. So the idea, you don't want values to be too dark, and then also the same with the bright ranges. You don't want values to be too bright either. So we don't want to go above 240. So if we look at something and say, I'm looking at maybe like a snow or something like that. Oh, it's snow. It must be white. Well, it's not actually white. You know what I mean? It's not pure white. So we just want to kind of have those types of guidelines in our mind when we're authoring our base color. So, like I said,
yeah, it's strange because it's very sort of counterintuitive when we say, oh, it's something white, we just move the slider. But I actually tried these values in, and it's true that white that's not quite white, but that's quite high up, really does look white.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it does. And
we just need to trust that.
And a lot of that too is our mind. It's just like we've got to always remember that we see things. Obviously, we see things with our eyes, and we're seeing the physics in play. And the light's being reflected back to our eyes. But then there's also this psychological thing that happens in our brain as we see things. So our brain will interpret. And it adds a lot to, I think it skews our perspective on what things are a lot of times, because our brain is also, you have like what our eyes are, physically seeing, and then we have, kind of the emotional part of what our brain is interpreting. And so we might see, oh, it's white, it's black, those kind of things. But, we just have to be aware of that. So kind of moving over to our next slide, I'm still talking about base color, so you can see that here. I've just have a kind of a map here that's showing an actual color value. We're still talking about base color, but what I'm talking about here is kind of the metal tint values that are in this. So like I said before, we would have a metallic map that's set to white, and so this white value indicates that the values for this area in the metallic map in the base color, they're going to represent metal tint. And so with metal, we're looking at a range of 60 to 100% specular. And so that means that these values for metal are typically going to be pretty bright. You can see here that I have some examples of gold, silver, aluminum, and so on. And then here next to it, we've got an sRGB value for this. And you'll notice that these metal tint values are all, like I said, they're pretty light in value. So the idea being that when we author these types of values into our base color map, we kind of want to hit this 60 to 100% specular. Now, another thing that I really want to stress is these values are not something that I just guess, arbitrarily. These are the actual measured values I was talking about before. So these are actual scientifically measured values, so we know what this tint value here for iron would be. So it's not, I'm not just making it up.
So again, it completely removes the idea of guesswork and multiple iterations and things like that. It means we're going to be able to work much quicker with this and maybe work on our maps, work on our, like we'll see in a minute, but work on the roughness and bring a little bit more life to our materials rather than spend all the time trying to decide, how do I make gold again?
Yeah, yes, precisely, yes.
Yeah.
Goes back to that consistent workflow.
Yeah.
So that takes care of our base color map. The next one I like to talk about is roughness, and the roughness map is it's the easiest map because there's really no guideline here. You can do no wrong with roughness, and it's the most creative map that you can author. So roughness is basically it's just describing the microsurface detail that scatters light. So here you can see that we have a rough surface, the light's coming in, and because of the rough surface, it's being scattered. And so a roughness map, white indicates rough and black indicates smooth.
Right. And this is I cannot stress how important this roughness is, because this is where all the patina of the material is going to happen. The use, the history, you can see on the ball there, all the little scratches. And so, but not only that, but it will also determine the reflectivity, because we are always looking for, where's my reflection map? Where's my glossy map? So this is where it all is going to happen, where a completely smooth material will be mirror. So that's with the black, where you've got the black little thumbnail here. That's going to illustrate a mirror, and a rough is going to illustrate something which is absolutely not reflective, like, well, I can't think of anything, maybe concrete, absolutely unpolished concrete, or things like sand maybe. So This is really where we will need to go to control how much reflection appears on our material. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's a good way to look at it because, like I said, we're talking about here. This roughness is describing, like we said, this microsurface detail. So it's basically, if it's more rough, it's going to diffuse the light more. So the same amount of energy is being reflected. But
Right.
the
But in all
appearance,
directions.
yes, but the appearance is that it looks dimmer. So the reflectivity, it looks dimmer, and we get a more diffuse surface. Where, as you said before, if we set this to pure black, we would get what appears to be like a perfect mirror.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
So moving on, we now have this slide here, which is a bit more technical, but it's very, very important to understand. And so what this slide here represents is what the specular channel in the UE4 material actually is. So when you look at this material in UE4, I had mentioned earlier that we're talking that this is a metallic roughness material, or I'm sorry, using the metallic roughness workflow. And so with that, in that workflow, a lot of things are handled specifically inside the shader. So I sometimes like to say things are hard-coded in the shader. So one of the things that's hard-coded is what we talk about our Fresnel. So here we have this Fresnel or our BRDF. And then we also have a Fresnel value at the 0 angle. So a Fresnel is going to go from 0 to 90 degrees. This is where we're going to get our glancing angle here at 90. So if we look at this in a term that you may hear often called F0, so this is just this value here at 0 degrees, there is a reflective amount or a reflective value that's indicated here. And for most common dielectrics, as I have listed here, now again, dielectrics meaning non-metal, most common dielectrics are going to be around 2 to 5%, reflective here at this 0 angle.
At point zero. So at the face that will be directly facing us when we look at it.
Yes, and as we move off towards 90 at this grazing angle, it's going to go to 100% reflective. And that's happening even if the surface is very diffuse. So this is this Fresnel angle. Now this is just completely set in the shader. We don't change this. It's all hard-coded in. And specifically with the metallic roughness workflow, this F0 value is also hard-coded in the shader. So what happens is inside the UE4 shader, when you have a black area in the metallic map, which indicates that that's not a metal, the F0 value is always going to be what's referred to as 4% reflective. It's hard-coded in the shader. So if you have, like, say, a concrete or a wood, again, being common dielectrics, the UE4 shader is just saying, okay, well, at F0, that's 4% reflective. Hard-coded into the shader. Now, UE4 gives you the ability to change that F0 value, and that is what that specular channel is. It just allows you to override this override this F0 value, but it gives you this ability, and it's very constrained, which is what I'm kind of showing here in this graph. So what happens is inside the UE4 shader, and that's what we're looking at in this graph, the value range for that specular channel is actually going from 0% to 8% reflective. And the UE4 shader's range is only a value between 0 and 1. So what it does is it takes this 0 and 8% and remaps it to 0 to 1. So at 0, we're getting 0, and at 1, we're getting 8%. So that means in UE4, if we were to take a constant value, set it to 0.5, and plug it into the specular channel, we'd be getting 4%, which is the exact same default hard-coded value that the metallic roughness uses for F0.
Right. So when it's at default, it's on 4%. When it's at maximum, it's at 8% when on the face that's looking at us directly. That's the only value that we're changing.
Exactly.
So what's if the material is a metal, does this then changes?
No, it does not. That's a very good point, Fabrice. No, it does not. This is only going to affect non-metal areas as indicated by black in the metallic map.
Right. But what I mean is if the material is a metal, complete metal, does the F0 value increase to something different?
No, it does
this?
not. No, it does not.
All right.
It's going to get that value from whatever is authored inside of the base color. So sometimes that's why I refer to that as metal reflectance value.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Right. So the metal base color, so we're going back now a little bit to the first slide,
Yeah,
will
let me just,
also indicate
that's going to be these values here. So at F0,
these
that's what these
values.
are.
Right. So this value will also indicate, it will indicate the color and how much reflection happens there.
Yes. Yes. So this is what
Right.
we're looking at
Right.
here with this metallic map.
Yeah. Excellent. Great.
And so it's nice to be able to understand what this range actually represents. And
Mm.
so you can see here that if we look at this from a value of 2 all the way up to 8, this value really doesn't change all that much. So that's another thing when you look at the this F0 value for dielectrics, that value doesn't really change drastically. However, depending on certain types of materials, you may want to have that flexibility to be able to change this if you need to. Like instead of being 4%, maybe 5 or closer to 6. Now, some things that you're going to be authoring, like say something like a gemstone, which here is kind of something I usually say is not maybe not typical. You're going to have it an 8% value, so you are going to need to override it in certain circumstances. But like I said, for most common dielectrics, they're going to fall between 2 and 5%.
So where would you place glass in all this? Because this is the question that we all have in ArcViz. We use glass, so much glass. Would we push the that to 1, so to have 8% for glass?
No, again, this isn't really something you would have to worry about here when you're using when you're thinking about glass. So the glass is going to use more of a specific kind of IOR type setting. Which is going to have, it depends if it's going to have some kind of transmittance value, and then it's going to use like an IOR to set what the glass is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So another thing too, if you read, if you go into the documentation for the specular channel inside UE4, they'll actually even talk about that this is something they don't really even recommend that you change. So they're like,
leave it alone.
Yeah, and they'll give you some specific use cases and so on. Okay, so that's how the specular channel works in this, and so just to kind of wrap up everything to the end. Now that we've come into the end of the slide here, we'd like to talk about key factors of PBR. And so energy conservation, that's going to be handled by the shader. The Fresnel, which is, the BRD.
So energy, sorry, I'll interrupt you. Energy conservation here, what we're talking about is the fact that there will be as much energy arriving onto the material than energy leaving the material.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's it's not something we need to worry about, but that's a physical fact.
Yes, that's again part of it being a physically based shading system, and again we don't have to worry about it because it's handled by the shader. The Fresnel also, we don't have to author or change that, so it's the BRDF, it's handled by the shader. And then what I like to say is when we look at specular intensity, it's controlled through the BRDF, roughness map, and the F0 reflectance value. So all three of those are what's really controlling what that specular intensity is. And now we know that, well, we're not changing the BRDF, and most of the time we don't even need to change that F0 value. So it's like you said earlier, Fabrice, you're really looking at that roughness map.
Yeah. Roughness is where all the creativity happens.
Exactly. Yes. Roughness is where you really, it's like you can really bring the material to life, meaning that you give it character. So a lot of times I look at, you can tell if it's how was the material handled? Was it handled with care? Was it just left outside? Is there scratches? If there's dents all over? Is there like dirt, dust, all that kind of stuff? Now that probably isn't very applicable to ArcViz, but in terms of just general use of PBR, the more realistic and the more effort you put in that roughness map, the more obviously realistic your surfaces are going to look.
Yeah, and I think it still is going to be true in ArcViz, except we will tend to have this extremely subtle and really tone it down. But I think if it's there, that will make the difference between something that will look very realistic or where something's going to be missing.
Yeah, that's correct. And so one of the last things I'll mention is this is kind of an advanced topic, so we won't really need to touch on it too much. But lighting calculations are computed in linear space. And again, this is all happening in the shader, so it's a huge topic. We don't have to get into it. But what that does is lead me to my next slide here, which is sometimes you need to be able to flag certain maps to be interpreted correctly by the shader. And I like to bring this up here in regards to UE4. So let's say that you've authored maps in, say, something like Photoshop, or maybe you're using Substance and you're exporting maps. Once you just import those maps as textures into UE4, what you'll need to do is make sure that here underneath the inside here where I have this this sRGB flag, we need to make sure that we set this map interpretation correctly. So for example, a really easy way to look at this is if it's color that we see. So again, we've said earlier that that's going to be referring to our base color. Then we need to come into here and we need to make sure that this sRGB is enabled. So here I see that color that we see, sRGB, this would be enabled. And it's enabled.
Needs to be ticked.
Yeah, and it's enabled by default. Now, what I'm showing here is a metallic map. And so also you'll notice that it's not just black and white. In this particular one, you can see it has some transitional values. So in this particular asset that I'm showing here, this has like a dirt level over top of it. So we have to account for things like that inside of our metallic map. So anyways, that's why you're not seeing this as a pure black and white map. Now, this map here represents what I would call data. So it's metallic, roughness, normal. Those maps represent data. So we need to tell the shader to interpret that information as linear. So we just need to make sure that we uncheck sRGB.
Yeah.
So it's as simple as map interpretation. If it's a color map, something that we see as color, then make sure sRGB is on. Anything else, make sure sRGB is off. And then that will give you the correct result in the shader. So sometimes if you place into that your metallic map or your roughness map and you look at that inside of your material and it still looks really, really glossy or something just doesn't look off, that's a real hint that you probably have one of your maps not set to be interpreted correctly.
And I can talk absolutely from experience when it doesn't look right. So many times I've had my roughness and I didn't know this. And again, this was the point when it wasn't set up correctly and I was scratching my head thinking, it doesn't work properly. But I guarantee that when you untick this setting for the roughness, it really does work very, very well.
Oh, yes, and it happens to all of us. I do it too. Like a lot of times I'll come in, I'm in a rush, I'm putting my maps together, and I forget that I didn't interpret a map correctly. And so it's very good to be aware of what this setting is.
Great. So here I am in this scene that I created for the little video for the webinar, and it's really simple. It was I was browsing through the source database of substances, and I saw this material, and it reminded me of the Vals spa in Switzerland by Peter Zumthor. So this is an image inspired from this beautiful piece of architecture, and it was incredibly easy to use because this material was simply drag and dropped from. So first of all, I'd just like to show you the quality of this material, the amount of variation, and it's a pretty complex material which would have taken a massive amount of work to do in Photoshop or in 3D or in any other way, I think. So tribute to that. So this is version 4.17, and we've just got this this source button here that's appeared on the interface, and it's because you can download the plugin as of a few days ago. I think it is now available on the marketplace for free. So what this does is when you click it, it opens up the substance source database where you've got to be logged in. I'm not quite sure if you get free textures in there, but once you're logged in, you've got access to all these textures that are very, very high quality and with parametric resolutions, meaning you can get them really high res or not, and you can just download them, and they appear straight into your interface. So here they just appeared straight onto my folder. And so I kind of went to town a bit and downloaded a few, and so it's really basically, it appears there. You grab the material and you just throw it in like this, and you know, again, these are really complex materials that would take a long time to create. You know, this is all with the bump and the roughness and everything all set up, and it just lands like this in your folder. It's pretty cool. Lots and lots to play with like that. And so obviously this one I took in, and it wasn't exactly like this, because this is the tile, you know, the dimensions are not exactly as I wanted them. So I opened this this red icon file, and within here I was able to play with my tiling. So I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to play with it now because it takes a little while to change. But very, very quickly I was able to get the right look that I wanted, and there's plenty of other things you can play with, the amount of marble you want, and here the damage on the edges, and the color, all of that stuff. So it's really, really interactive. So Wes is going to show us how to set up something like this, and how we get this similar sort of interaction in Substance Designer. And so let's go and do that.
Okay, so Fabrice, here in this section, what I wanted to do was just kind of show some of my process for creating a material here, just using Designer. So one of the things that I like to do to start, and you can see that this is a node-based interface, so we're just going to, what I like to say is composite up a couple of these different noises to create a material. But I just want to show you kind of the process that I use to start with. So here inside of Designer, we have this base material node here. And so I start with this node always, and you can see that we have the ability to set what PBR workflow we're going to use. Since we're in UE4, I'm going to use Metal Rough, and I'm going to set this to be a dielectric preset. And then I just right-click and drag and drop that here into my 3D view. And so what this allows me to do is just kind of work as like a modeling material. So here, if I just kind of move my light around a little bit, you can see that here I have this roughness value. So if I set this to pure black, it's super smooth. And as we increase this, we get more rough. So again, kind of hitting home some of those PBR values that we had talked about earlier.
So is this base material a kind of material made for that, a standard kind of bland material to build on? Or is it got some? Is it used for something else?
No, it's precisely that. It's it could
Right.
have several uses, but yeah, it just gives you a quick starting point to create a generic PBR material. Now here in this case, if I wanted to, like I said, I could start to tint the color value and just get myself an idea of what's happening.
So it's a really easy startup material with all these things built in there on the right, basically.
Exactly, yes. And I like to start with this as like what I say is my modeling material, and that's because when I look at my graph, I always start with height. And I think it's very important when you're creating a material to always start, and this isn't just Substance Designer, this is if you're using any type of application, to start with, say, your height, your roughness, normal, ambient occlusion, just to get those types of maps that really describe the surface attributes. If you can nail those down, doing the color last is going to be, it makes it actually very, very easy. Because if you can really nail down things that are very, very important, like your roughness map and your normal information, then everything else on top of that is going to be built from that. So, for example, like
so, this goes back to what you were saying earlier about how our mind interprets what we see. Because what we were saying the other day actually is how we will look for tactile information in the material. So our eyes will try and find clues of how this material will feel to our fingers, to our hands. So what you're saying is that that's what we start with, how it will actually feel with the tip of our fingers and working through the height.
Yeah, that's another way to look at it that I think that that's pretty good. Also, too, by authoring our maps such as our roughness and our normal, those kind of maps that again, like I told you, the roughness being the micro displacement. Taking care of that micro surface and really describing the material and the way that light is going to be scattered or diffused across it. Once we kind of nail those properties down of how the physicality of how that material is going to work. Once that looks really, really good and that's correct, doing things like adding color and on top of it's so much simpler. And we know that the material is going to look really good.
It makes sense also when it reminds me of how learning to paint or learning to draw, we will use plaster casts and draw off of a white, completely white model made out of plaster because it's so much simpler. We don't have the color to worry about.
Yes.
This is I'd say it's a very traditional artistic workflow.
Yes.
From all fine art and paint or charcoal or pencil. We will to work in black and white and just to capture the essence like this first.
Yes, exactly. That I love that term too, capture the essence. That's really good. And then also like the distraction of color is not coming into play at this stage. So
yes, and again, completely opposite to the old school, well, my workflow, I would say.
Oh no, it's the
10 years.
Yeah, it's definitely the traditional workflow because myself, I was there as well. So yes, I always used to start with a diffuse map, with all my color in it. Yeah. So like I said, I use this as my starting point, and right now I like to say this is kind of like my modeling material. And so we're going to come back to this here in just a moment. So here you can see that basically just in my library we ship with a lot of these procedural noises and patterns that you can use here. And this being procedural, you can have infinite variations on how you work with these. So what I start here is just with a series of maps, and like I said, I'm right here, I'm trying to build up this height information. So if we start with something like, say, this black and white spots, and then here you can see that I'm just running a real simple high pass. Here if I hit my space bar, I can do a search, and I can start to search for different nodes that I want to work with. So here's high pass. Here I'm using just a solid uniform color here, and I'm just using a blend. So this is a blend which blends between a foreground. So if I zoom in, you can see this is my foreground, this is my background uniform color, and I'm just simply lowering this opacity value just to kind of get something really basic pattern. Yeah. And here with this blend node, it's again foreground over background. We have all of these blending modes, which are similar to what you would find in, say, something like Photoshop. So it's just it's a pretty simple kind of compositing operation that we're doing here. With that said, you can see that I've got a levels control, so a little histogram. Again, something simple coming from Photoshop to just reprocess these value ranges.
So to reiterate here, all we're doing is we're applying very familiar Photoshop actions onto our image, but what we're looking at is the history of it. We're just doing one operation, moving on to the next one, moving on to the next one, and all these are very, very standard to anybody who's used Photoshop before. So although it looks a bit foreign, it's all very it all feels very familiar.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, since it looks familiar, foreign with this node-based interface, but the workflow itself can be very familiar. And this node-based interface allows us to have a lot of flexibility in creating a non-destructive texture so that we can go and make changes and tweaks at any time. So here's another example where I took another just kind of basic kind of grunge map that I pulled just straight from our library. It also has some parameters here that you can set to get a specific look. Here I'm just using a transform node just to kind of rotate and just change it a little bit. So I've got a little transform gizmo here that I can kind of work with in that 2D view. And then once again, I'm just blending this back into my previous result that I had. So here in the foreground, we have this noise. Here in the background, we have our previous operation. And here you can see that I'm just blending them by just lowering the opacity. And so the idea here is that we start simple and we just start to node by node layer this effect. And that really follows the complexity of materials. So if you look at a real world surface, you can see that nothing is as simple as it may appear. If we look at just something like this wood table that I'm working on, you know, if I look at this from a microscopic level, it's layers upon layers of data and information that really break up or make this surface what it is. And so here in Designer, I can kind of mimic that real world kind of approach by just layering things up, taking a simple approach step by step and to create a complex material.
That's a really interesting. It's a lovely way of thinking about it. It's like recreating nature layer by layer and layer by layer effectively, and then when we go to this roughness and all this reflectivity and all these very subtle changes, which is going to be what makes the material look so real.
Exactly. Here's another case in point. You know, with procedural, it's variation upon variation is key. So here I just add another grunge map, and then again another simple blend over top to get even more complex. So we can see that this texture is starting to get more and more complex as I work through it, but really all I'm doing here is just a couple different nodes, blending them together. This time I'm using a max lighten mode and dropping the opacity. Here's another grunge map that I'm just layering in, and this time just dropping the opacity to get even more information. So here at the stage is when we get to this map that I have here, and like I said, this is going to represent my height. So once I kind of have something, this is where my base material node comes into play. So I want to.
Sorry. So when you say height, what do you mean? Is it going to be this what would be translated as the normal map, or
it will become that? Yes, it will become
Right.
the normal. So you have height, which could stand for, I guess one way you could look at it would be a bump map. Another way you could look at it would be a displacement map. So basically it's this grayscale information that's describing kind of the surface irregularities, we'll say, and we're going to use this to create our normal map. So here, in this case, this is just going to become, well, in the case of this material, I kind of did things a little bit differently. So I have a lot of noise here, and I didn't want to put all of this type of noise into my normal map. So what I ended up doing here was just going back to, again, just showing this kind of non-linear approach. So here at this node, we have all of this information, but really what I'd like to do for my normal is just really get something more simple like this type of map. So I can just take the result of what I have here and just plug that, and here I ran a levels just to get a bit more intensity in those values. And then I just create a normal map node, which then just creates the normal information for me. And so here I just have a simple intensity slider. And so where this base material comes into play, and here you can actually see where I used it here. So at this stage, I have my detail that I have, and I've also used or pulled out from that detail some information that I created my normal information from. So now what I do is I come over just to my base material, and I just enable my normal channel, so you can see it just shows up here, and then I feed it right here into that base material. And so now here on my 3D model, if I zoom in real close, hopefully we can see that here in the video. But here's another case in point where it's nice to use this base material. So right now I haven't authored color, I haven't authored roughness, but this base material lets me play with, okay, well, let me increase my roughness and let me see what more diffusion is going to look like with this normal. And I could say,
I mean, here it shows absolutely right there the limitations we would have on working from a diffuse map. I mean, how many times I grabbed a material off the internet, an image off the internet, which was going to be the diffuse map, and I have absolutely no control over what the normal will be other than just taking the diffuse map and turning it into normal. I wouldn't have been able to extract only some of the grain out of it.
Right, exactly. And that's, again, that goes back to us being able to, we built up this very complex map that we're going to use, but right now for the normal, I just wanted this little bit of information. So I'm able to just get exactly what I need when I need it. And so here you can see that now I can just interactively play around with this roughness to see what this normal is going to look like when I start to feed in some roughness. So the roughness being one of the most important maps that we have, that's why we wanted next to work on the roughness. And so a really fast way of doing that is just to use, again, the information that I have. So for example, here's the map that I have. And what I do is I use a node that I call the histogram range node. And I'll just plug this into here. And if I set this range all the way to 1, it gives me exactly the result that I had before. Now I've got this position value, and if I start to lower this, you can see that I'm lowering the value, so it's getting darker, which means it's going to be more smooth, but we still have a lot of this kind of intricate variation here within this noise pattern. And this is what we were talking about before, with this roughness map being like the king map, the most creative map. So all this detail. So now what I can do is take this map here, and I'm just going to come over to my base color, and I will enable my roughness input and just feed this in. And so now I'm getting variation here in that roughness information. But I can go back to this node here, and I can make adjustments to it. So I can make it more rough or smooth, maybe something more like this. And if I just kind of move the lighting around this, you can see how that roughness and the normal and everything's starting to come together to create this overall surface.
It just looks like it's suddenly the material's got history.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
It's lived. But again, the number of times I've tried to tweak an image because in Unreal, where the roughness, the difference in the contrast, the high and the lows of the image were too high for the roughness, and here it really shows how subtle. It's very, very close range of grays here. There's no white or black or...
Yeah, this is the roughness that we're creating. You can see it has all of this rich detail that we've been working with. And here, as you'll demonstrate later, we can expose this value, which then when we use the substance, if we create this as a substance material and use that in UE4, this position value here that I have for my roughness will be available to me to tweak in real time in UE4. So once I bring it in, I can make changes to, how much reflectivity I'm getting here based on, again, how I tweak that roughness range.
Yeah, very powerful.
So here in the end, what I also want to do is talk about my color. So like I said before, we start with this noise that we've created, this procedural map. I run it through a gradient map. And if I look here at my gradient editor, let me just bring this over from my other monitor. There we go. You can see that this allows me to just process the grayscale ranges in my map. So black being on the left and white being on the right here, I can just plot keys with different color values to colorize this. And usually what I do is I just have an image of, like, say, concrete or whatever I'm working with. I have it up, and I can use this pick gradient tool and just left click and drag across my image and actually sample these keys in real time. So then literally my color operation in the end just becomes pick gradient, just select my source image, and it's done. And that's it. That's pretty much, a lot of times you can get, about 80% of the work done with color just by using this tool, which is really nice. So this gives me my color. And then here I gave myself a Huesaturation node. So I just made some adjustment here to my lightness value. You don't see the value here because, again, I did the expose that I had talked about before. So that value is now going to be available to me in UE4 when I tweak this material in real time, so I can make lightness adjustments to my color map without having to come back to Designer. It's another thing. You don't have to go back and forth out of UE4. You can stay in UE4 and make all these color corrections. Here you can see that this is my original base material node. Base material node. So I just have all my images piped into these, and in the end, I send these to my outputs. Also, one last thing I'll mention here, what's nice about this base material is if I wanted to start to layer materials together, I can now do that. So let's say I had another material that I had placed here. I could use a material blend node to blend two different materials at this high material level. So here at the beginning of the graph, we're working on very granular node by node, and then we start to go through what I call a map extraction phase, which is where we create our color, our normal. Here's where I just use an ambient occlusion node just to quickly create some ambient occlusion, and this becomes our roughness. These all get fed into a base material, and then I can start doing more high-level material layering. Maybe this is concrete, and there's another, maybe a ceramic type material on top with this, somehow blending, and so on. So
so that really shows the use of using this method, even though it would make sense to not have to plug these nodes directly into the final material nodes in the end, but this is, I would say, would you say this is good practice?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And again, like
do it
I
that
always
way.
kind of work this way because you can see early on, it allows me to quickly work with my, work with my values as I'm building this up. And then at any time, we can just right click any of these nodes and just drag them here into our 3D view. So here you can see is the another version of this with more of the color in play and so on. And so if I want to make a quick tweak, just right click, drag this material in, and now I can quickly view what this material is doing and so on.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so this has just been kind of like a brief overview of how I use Substance Designer to author these physically based textures that we then use inside of UE4.
Great, fantastic. So next, I'll just fire up my scene, and then we'll just import this texture and see how we just play with it
Great.
very quickly.
Sounds awesome.
So here I am in the lobby scene that we've seen before. So all I did is import this substance and throw it onto the the geometry. That's all there is to it. Then I opened this instance file and I played around with the parameters. So just to go full screen a little bit here and show you how much this substance actually has. My computer is a bit laggy because there's quite a few scenes open here, so if it crashes, stay with me. But really, look how realistic that is. There's so much variation. You really see how all the channels have been separated, treated separately. The normal, in this case, the roughness, so look at the variation in the way the material the reflection on the material has evolved. It looks like it's lived. That's really the best way I can put it. So it's really, although it's all very sort of technical, it ends up being a very, very artistic tool. And then we've got this great normal happening here with our bump being very, very effective at giving us a feel for the way this material would actually feel under our feet. Even if we touched it, it feels cold, and so that's really very, very exciting. So all now we can play with that roughness amount that was exposed in the substance, and so here I get a completely different look, and so you see that it's really affecting all the layers at the same time. There you go. So really great fun to play with, and especially on those very, very fine settings where you want it just like that, just to break up the reflection. That's where all the subtlety happens, and where I think you get this very good, very precise artistic kind of tool. So now let's see in the other scene, and so this is the exact same substance, right? I just imported it. It's the same material, same parameters, and all I did is change the lightness, right, and the roughness amount as well. So if I bring it down again, we get the same floor as before, but you see how versatile it is. I can have a completely different looking floor with exactly the same substance. So you can imagine on something more complex the amount of versatility you can achieve. Building a library like that would be really would be a good idea, I think. So there you go. Right, well, I hope that was fun and useful, and I hope you're going to have a lot of fun with all that stuff. And great, well, see you next time.